was an insect that evolved really in Europe, the better part of the European continent. They came to the United States courtesy of our ancestors who brought them here. There's some great stories in old ship manifests about honeybees being brought over from Europe. The first one to arrive in the United States was the German honeybee. It was a black little honeybee that was just mean as a snake and just terribly difficult to work with. And they would often, at least as has been written in some of the historic records, this honeybee was just terrible. Aggressive, mean, and so that gave the opportunity for beekeepers to start looking at the other races and subspecies of honeybees, and I'll show you those in a few minutes. Honeybees are eusocial. It means they're truly social. They're a lot like us in that capacity, in that there are kind of four, if you remember back to your biology class, there's sort of four definitions of what a truly social organism is. The first is that they have a reproductive division of work, which of course we don't, but honeybees do, and based on your sex, you'll do a different job. And not only your sex, but sometimes your sex and your age, you'll do a different job within the hive. They have sterile casts, so there are members of your honeybee colony that are completely sterile, that cannot reproduce. They're overlapping generations, and they have this really interesting way of cooperating within that hive to care for the next generation, to care for the young. And so they are a truly social insect. Now, as I alluded to earlier, if we can get to it, I'd really like to give a talk on some of the emerging research into honeybees, especially as it pertains to genetics and to the proteomics of honeybees. How insects sort of create and propagate this idea of amazing cooperation. It's completely counter to how you would think evolution would work. Evolution selects for the strongest, right? I mean, it's what we've all been told in biology classes. So how has evolution selected for an insect that behaves completely unlike anything that we would expect it to? It's fascinating work, and it's all because we can now do some pretty sophisticated genomics work. And so if we get to it, I'd love to give you that talk. Back to honeybees and sort of where we are. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the first honeybees to arrive in the United States was Apis mellifera, and so we have a genus, a species, and an insect we can talk about, race. And so that's the second line here. These are the more common races of honeybees. So Apis mellifera was a German honeybee. Some of the written records sort of called this the white man's fly, because as sort of the pioneers were moving west, they brought bees with them, and it was part of their diet, right? And they depended on it for so many things. And so oftentimes, as the early pioneers were moving westward, they were bringing bees with them. Those bees were sort of escaping over time, and they were colonizing out in front of the pioneers as they would go. And so, as it's kind of written down, they were, as they called the white man's fly. It's sort of one way to think about the role of honeybees in the U.S., but they quickly found, or the honeybees quickly found, that the U.S. was very suitable to their needs. And so we had quite a large feral bee population, in other words, wild, more or less bees, in the environment until the varroa mites arrived. And that pretty much decimated, if not fairly well eliminated, all of the wild bees in the U.S.
When
so,
was that? What year was
the
that?
1980s.
1980s?
Yeah.
Oh, that recent?
Yeah, so the varroa mite's only been here for the last 20 years or so. There's some conjecture of what was the actual date, but it took a while, obviously, to spread through the U.S. because it's a tiny little mite that's passed when one bee kind of gets close enough to another bee that the mite can crawl from one to the other. So it really requires fairly close contact in order to move. But jumping back to the races, so we talked about the Apis mellifera, the German honeybee, mean, nasty. I've met some Germans that were that way. A little more sharp on the edges. And then beekeepers started thinking, well, I wonder if there are other races of honeybees out there that could be a little easier to take care of. And so largely the honeybee that you would start with as a beginning beekeeper is Apis mellifera linguistica. It's the Italian honeybee. Laissez-faire, laid back, pretty calm, pretty gentle. I've known some times that are that way too. And Apis mellifera linguistica originates from Italy. And then being really creative beekeepers and sort of entomologists over the last hundreds of years or so they started mixing these races together with the intention of kind of trying to get the most ideal traits from each sort of group, right? So I told you before that the German honeybees tended to be a little more aggressive. Well, it's not bad. If you're trying to be an insect that's living in a fairly hostile environment, being defensive is not bad. The Italian honeybee, on the other hand, is much more gentle. The Carnolian honeybees, kind of midway between the two. And so, interestingly enough, a lot of the original breeding work came out of monasteries. And the monks that would spend their time breeding these insects back and forth to try to create some of these novel races of honeybees, we refer to them as. And these races are commercially available today, although when you start looking through your catalogs, I would like for you to really consider Apis mellifera linguistica, the Italian honeybee. Very, very excellent bee to work with. Worked with it with a lot of beginning beekeepers. Bless you. And years later, you can get into some of the more novel races. But getting into the castes, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 castes of honeybees. And when I use the word caste, think of it sort of similarly maybe to the way you've heard about it in your old social studies class, where these castes are segregated by sex and segregated by how they were treated when they were an egg. So these are sort of the 3 castes. Your honeybees will not be this large, but these are relatively scale. The one on the left is the worker, the one in the middle is the queen, and the one on the right is the drone. Just your very first impressions. So the worker looks shorter than the queen. The queen has this really long abdomen, and the drone has these big something going on with his head, and he's got a round butt. Just your first impressions. Take that away, and we're going to talk about why each of these castes look the way that they look, and sort of the jobs that they have in the hive, because for you as a beekeeper, you're going to be interacting mostly with workers. Now, workers are females, and these female workers are genetically identical to the queen, in the sense that there's no genetic difference between a worker bee and a queen bee. And we're going to start talking about kind of teasing apart some of the differences in the jobs that they do. But just think back to the point I told you earlier, the new work is all about how genes get turned off and on in honeybees. Because the worker and the queen are genetically identical, but yet their role in the hive is quite different. So worker bees, their jobs are based on the days since they emerged, or days since they were born. So when an egg gets laid, typically the worker, from egg to emergence, or egg to adult, it's about 21 days. From day 2 until day 10, after that worker has emerged, they're called the nurse bee. You can see this little cartoon down here. This worker bee is taking care of the little larvae, the next generation. That's kind of why honeybees are considered eusocial. They have this cooperative care of the young. And the workers that are 2 to 10 days old take care of the young for the next generation. Around day 11, from day 11 to day 20, the glands on the underside of their abdomen mature and they start to extrude wax. And so that's, again, the material that they're using to build the cells that the new generations are being reared in. And that's around day 11. And around day 21, they sort of develop this interest in foraging. And as you kind of see from this cartoon, they are collecting nectar and pollen and water. And so generally around day 21 until day 35. Now, here's an interesting question. Well, what happens at day 35? Die. Sometimes, generally, about day 35, they're dead. One of the key things to remember about honeybees, unlike some of the other insects and even some of the arachnids, to be honest, honeybees cannot regenerate their body parts. So what happens around day, again, 35 is that they truly work themselves to death. They have, the worker has flown so many times between flowers and back to the hive that her wings are just riddled and she can't fly anymore. She can't molt. And I think that's a really interesting point about honeybees. They don't molt, unlike, again, some of the other arachnids, they can't grow new legs. So when you're keeping your bees, always be very mindful about how you're moving around and that you're not squishing them or accidentally pull a leg off or break a wing, because that's a dead bee. That bee can't do anything else. They can't of regenerate that. So around day 35, she's worked herself to death. Now granted, a 35-day-old honeybee in the middle of winter is not flying, and so her age is much older. But in general, as they're foraging, 35-day-old bee is dead, thereabouts. So I want to show you a couple of really great pictures using scanning electron microscopy. So here's a picture on the left-hand side of a worker honeybee that's kind of making its way along a flower. Now notice the little kind of color-enhanced yellow little dots all over the place. That's pollen. And so as this honeybee is kind of working its way through its flower, it's sending its proboscis down into the nectaries of the flower, it's getting this pollen kind of just passed all through its body. Here's a picture on the top right-hand corner of what that pollen would look like under a really high SEM image. You see this pollen sort of all kind of stuck together, and it's sticking to one of the hairs on the honeybee. And I use the word hair sort of loosely, bear with me. So eventually what will happen is after that honeybee is kind of walked around this flower, and you'll see this in your own gardens, is she has a comb on the back of one of her legs, and she'll sort of comb her body, and she'll pack that pollen together into a little pollen basket. And when you start keeping your bees, you'll notice as the bees are flying in and out of their hives, some of them will have these little kind of globule-looking things on the back of their knees, and you'll say, geez, do my bees have cancer? No, that's pollen. And remember, pollen is critical in the diet for protein. That's their only source of nitrogen, the building blocks of protein. And so that pollen collection becomes very critical for a honeybee. Every year I get asked this question about workers and flight, and so I decided to include it in this talk. So 1934, and it's kind of interesting how some of these urban legends get propagated through the years. 1934, a French entomologist sort of got his calculator out, and he said, well, geez, by all intents and purposes, honeybees mathematically should not be able to fly. And sort of that has propagated itself through the many generations. And so a group of researchers at Caltech and UNLV decided that they would use high-speed digital photography to take a picture of a honeybee flying and try to sort of resolve this question about, number one, how does a honeybee fly? Does it flap its wings, sort of like you can imagine a child that's trying to run off the top of a roof flapping its wings up and down? Or does it do something different? I want to show you that image here. So what I want you to pay attention to is, we'll watch this a couple times. You're going to watch the bee kind of move up and down, but I want you to pay attention to the edge of that wing. Oh. So technology. Here we go. Okay. So a couple of key things to look at. Notice how when that wing comes forward, it folds down and it comes back out. So really using this kind of high-speed imagery, the group was able to make some really fascinating discoveries about how honeybees fly. And I'm sharing that with you. Oh, you can see it very clearly now. Notice how it looks like when that wing comes forward, it stops, flops over, and reverses its direction. The researchers said, wow, this is really fascinating, but let's see if we can take this one step further. And the question becomes how do honeybees sort of hover and fly and accomplish this amazing amount of work that they do in order to make honey and to sort of keep their hive alive. And so I'm kind of giving you some background on the experiment. So the researchers were using kind of an atmosphere made of oxygen and helium, and sort of started comparing something called a Reynolds number. And if you're familiar with the Reynolds number, it's kind of a measure of resistance, more or less. What I want to take away is that at the very bottom, honeybees, they maintain a constant wing beat, regardless of the amount of work. Okay, so imagine that if you're trying to run, you're running up a hill, you take a certain number of steps per second. Now imagine if you were to put like a huge stack of tires on a sled, and now you're trying to pull it up the same hill, right? Can you take the same number of steps to cover the same distance? That's essentially what they're trying to ask the question of here. How does a honeybee accomplish this work? I mean, if you're trying to go up a hill, do you still take 5 steps a minute, or do you take 1 step a minute and pull really hard for the next step? And so, using kind of this acrylic wing model, the researchers, they kept the beat frequency. And what they figured out is that The honeybee itself, in order to accomplish this work, beats the wings at the same speed, but just changes how far up and down, from the top to the bottom, the amplitude of that stroke happens. So if you kind of look at the yellow line at the very top, this would be the largest sort of upstroke, downstroke, back to the upstroke. And that corresponds to a much greater amount of force. And so what the researchers are sort of concluding is that the way that honeybees accomplish their flight, number one, is more or less a rotation of the wing, not just sort of like a child flapping up and down like they're pretending they're a bird. It's a rotation, and that sort of rotating back part of the wing generates a tremendous amount of force. And when the honeybee is working, it's carrying a heavy load, it keeps the up and down, the strokes the same. It just changes how far the distance is from up to down. That's honeybee flight for you. Back to workers. We're going to take a break in about 5 minutes just to give you a chance to stretch your leg. So here's some pictures of workers and queens. So I mentioned earlier, workers, they're female, genetically no different than the queen. Same number of genes, everything you would expect. But they're sterile. So here's a picture of the queen. Now, you may also, when you order your honeybees, you may have them mark the queen. It's the little tiny dot of paint right on the top of the queen's back, right on top of that thorax. Here's the queen in the center here. Now notice this sort of ring of workers around the queen. This ring of workers is often called her attendants, and that's one of the best ways that you can use as a beekeeper to find the queen when you're looking for it in your hive, is to find this sort of odd arrangement of honeybees kind of around another one. So that's the queen. To give you a sense again of scale, we're going to pass around some, or at least I'll show you some equipment in the second lecture. And when you're working with Sarah out in the apiary, you're going to start taking her about hives, and you're going to take them apart, and you'll start seeing frames and things. But I'm just going to show you a picture. There's some cells that the workers are being reared in. The next cast is the queen. Let's get through the queen really quickly, and we'll take a quick break. So the queen, again, is female. As I told you earlier, she's essentially genetically identical to the worker. I mean, they basically come from the same type of egg. And this has led researchers to get really, really puzzled, especially the evolutionary biologists. How can you have one egg, and at some point in time in that egg's life, it either becomes a sterile worker, or it becomes a fertile queen? It's the same egg, same genetic material. And so, really early on, the researchers sort of landed, I mean, these are many decades ago kind of level of research, that the larvae, after that egg hatches, the larvae of the queen is fed a special diet. And it's a food that they're fed. It's called royal jelly. And they're fed copious amounts of royal jelly. I hope you try royal jelly sometime when your bees make it. I hope you try it and tell me what you think. Oh, it's just jam-packed with sugar and hormones, and it made my mouth go numb. I didn't like it all that much, but maybe you will. The larvae, back to this point, if I'm ever with you in the apiary, I always make my students eat weird stuff. You're going to eat larvae, you'll eat eggs, you'll eat all kinds of those interesting things, and we'll dare each other to do it. But the larvae, after that egg hatches, is fed this really this diet that is really rich in sugar and hormones. And that diet causes those ovaries to develop in the queen. And so when I showed you earlier, this queen has this really long abdomen. That's because her ovaries are sexually developed. They're mature. Whereas the worker, you can see just kind of compared to her here, this worker, the abdomen is really kind of short and stunted. And that's because the eggs have not developed. Whereas in the queen they have. And again, some of the fascinating points of the more current research is how can a food, this royal jelly, cause genes to be turned off and on. And not only that, but then certain proteins to be expressed. It's really fascinating. Imagine if you were to eat a brownie, and that caused you to become sterile or not sterile compared to your sister. Or it's really fascinating that you have an insect here that's diet can regulate its gene expression. And so that's been the latest work. I get really excited about that. There's a couple of additional physical differences between queens and workers. And queen and worker, both of the two females. The primary job of the queen is to lay fertilized eggs. she is largely a captive of this larger organism, which is the hive. The queen is fed this royal jelly diet her whole life, and she's largely confined to this hive. She leaves once, but we'll talk about that in a minute, but she lays eggs every day. Sometimes she'll lay up to 2,000 eggs. Tiny little insect, laying 2,000 eggs a day in the summertime. And so she's largely held captive. She's born in cells that will look a lot like a peanut. And I'm sure Sarah will show you some of these out in the apiary. If you ever see these in your hive, when you are starting your new hive, please call me immediately. We'll talk about how to fix some of those problems. In a hive, there is kind of like Lord of the Rings, there can be only one. Very true about queens. There can be one queen. If there are two queens, there will be a fight, and there will be someone that dies. There can be only one. And so if you start seeing a colony that's starting to make a queen cell, or make new queens, something could be going wrong, and you might need to have an intervention. Possibly. Queens that you're going to be buying and using are produced. This is a picture of sort of how they are produced. There's some really interesting breeding work that's happening right now within the queen rearing community, using these little cups to make these queen cells. And then the queens are then sold commercially in packages of honeybees, as well as Dennis alluded to earlier, you can just buy a queen off the internet if you want to. And so they're reared in these special cells. Here's another great image of a queen in kind of the middle. Notice again this long thorax, this long abdomen here, compared to the workers with these little short stunted. And you'll start to recognize your queen as you're working with your bees and as you're inspecting them. You'll start to recognize her, and she may not ever recognize you, but you'll start recognizing her and it's kind of some of her behaviors. I alluded to earlier that one of the things you can ask when you're buying your packages of honeybees, we'll talk about that later, is to have your queens marked. So I'm going to show you this picture probably a few times, but notice that this little queen has a little red dot of paint on the top of her thorax. Makes her a lot easier to see when she's sort of with all the rest of the workers that are happening in town. With that, let's take a break. Take 10 minutes if you could, grab a quick drink, and come back, and we're going to get on the drones. Drones are the guys.